and welcome along once again to It'll Be Alright in the 90s, the podcast that's too fast to live and too stupid to die. I'm Stu Joslin, and joining me, as always, is Alex Greenwood. Greenie, good evening, mate. How are you doing?
I'm doing good, Stu. I have just cracked open my first bottle of Reef for the evening, as you can see, so that is going to do me well, I think, this evening and give me a nice energetic burst and hopefully things don't get out of hand.
It's a very suitable drink. I am on the lager for this evening because we're being lads, and we are discussing the recent documentary on Loaded magazine that was aired on BBC Two, and also a little bit of chat about lad and ladette culture in general. That's all to come, but first of all, a quick word from our sponsor tonight, Fiendish Faces from St Ivel. Listeners can quote the code ALRIGHT90s at participating stores to get 20% off a multi-pack of Fiendish Faces, including Spooky Wookie, Fangs a Lot, Frankenstein and Rattle and Roll flavours, or if you prefer, banana, strawberry, raspberry and chocolate. That's thanks to our sponsors tonight, Fiendish Faces, real fruit puree, less sugar.
Very nice. Fangs a Lot is a good one. That's a good name, isn't it?
I think so. Were you ever a Fiendish Faces guy? I had Fiendish Faces. I think beforehand they might have been Fiendish Feet, and then they turned into Fiendish Faces later on.
Yeah, I think I was part of the Fiendish Feet generation. Mm-hmm. Not that I ever had one, but they were on the shelves when I was the right age, definitely, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Very
absolutely.
recognisable.
I remember Fiendish Faces very well, so it is great to have them on board tonight. Time for a look at the bulletin board and a delve into the post bag. Alex, I believe you've got a message there for us to read out.
I do, yes. A message from Dad of the Pod, who's giving us an update on the goings-on down at the Masonic Lodge. Mm-hmm. And his message reads thus. I've got new hearing aids, and now I can hear all sorts of things that passed me by before. Birdsong, delightful gurgle of Wincarnis leaving the bottle for the glass, and the faint hissing sound that Alex's mother makes when she detects one of my unforced errors around the house. I am also better placed to detect Jeff as he approaches with another scheme requiring early investment. It was only because I was mid-nap in the Masonic Lodge quiet room that he managed to corner me with his latest. He's invented a new cocktail that he believes will challenge his supremacy of Advocaat and lemonade at Christmas. He's provisionally calling it the Congo Sledgehammer, and he had a sample for me to test. Alas, I cannot wholeheartedly endorse it. Who could have foreseen that the two outstanding beverages like Wincarnis and Umbongo, when mixed together with a large dash of cayenne pepper, would produce something so injurious to physical and mental well-being? I coughed for a good 30 minutes after just one sip. When I recovered, Jeff said I shouldn't judge it after just one drink, so I had another and coughed for a further half hour. He's gone away to fine-tune the recipe. I suggested he should fine-tune it by removing the Umbongo and cayenne pepper, but I don't think he heard me. Old Bob was also persuaded into testing it and had to spend the night under observation in Chippenham Hospital. He's out now and recuperating, but he says at the time he thought he was a goner. Jeff says the cocktail probably just needs a bit more cayenne pepper in it. Anyway, I'd be aware of Jeff bearing bottles for a while.
Wow, great update from the Masonic Lodge there. I went for a job at Chippenham Hospital on Chippenham Hospital Radio about 10 years ago, but they never got back to me, so things could have turned out a lot differently, couldn't they, if I'd been given that job?
Yeah, you could have been down there as all that was going on and got involved. Well, yes, keep them coming and Dad of the Pod. We always enjoy those messages and finding out what's going on with Jeff, because Lord knows he doesn't tell us anything, does he, Stu?
No, I haven't actually seen him since the Christmas party.
No.
Yeah, he sort of disappeared halfway through that, and then we've not seen him since. So, yeah, Jeff, do get in touch, because, the mail's piling up around here.
Yeah, the fax machine's on the blink, isn't it? And I don't know how to fix it at all, so...
No.
Come and have a look at that, Jeff.
Something to do with ribbons and things, I don't know. It's a bit weird, isn't it? But maybe he's off trying to get bulk buy deals on cayenne pepper and Umbongo, it sounds like. So,
yeah, that could be
could be chasing those down. I have some football news from 1996, if you're interested. I'm leaving that in.
Sorry, I was just taking a swig of Reef. Yes, I'm definitely interested. Please go.
Excellent. Well, since before Christmas, I have been dipping in and out of this fine tome. I'll hold it up here for Alex to see. It's the 1996-97 official PFA Footballers Fact File here. The facts and figures on over 2,000 professional players. Now, keen listeners to the podcast might remember our books episode that we did a little while ago, in which I identified Soccer 97 as one of my favourite books of the 90s, and that was pure statistics. That was just lists of players' names, dates of birth, heights, weight, and their stats. This is pretty much the same, but there are also little pen picks of each player. So the editor here, a fine upstanding chap by the name of Barry J. Hugman, has gone to the trouble of putting a little potted biography of each player here. And there's some dynamite stuff in here, and I've been marking down some of my favourites in order to bring to you on the podcast. So I want to start with a player called Simon Dakin. Is that a familiar name to you, Alex? Have you ever heard of him?
No, I don't think so.
I'm not surprised you haven't, because he was playing for Hull City at the time. Used at right back and in midfield by Hull, Biscuit, who saved his more impressive performances for the sweeper role, was lucky to see out the 1995-96 season after a death-defying 50-foot plunge down a lift shaft whilst on holiday in Tenerife. After fracturing 2 ribs, suffering a collapsed lung and cuts to his knee and arms and head, he made a remarkable recovery to be back in action by November. Released at the end of the season. So that's Simon Dakin for you. Now, obviously, this only goes up to the end of the 95-96 season, so I had a little look to see where Simon Dakin went in his football career after he was released by Hull, and it looks like he sort of drifted around a non-league scene for a while after that. But I can tell you, and I have verified that this is the same person, he is now the chairman, director and solicitor corporate and commercial for a very high-flying firm of lawyers, and there is an email address on this page that I'm looking at. So I'm just wondering if maybe we should contact Simon and ask him for a bit more information. Maybe if I start the email with "Hi Biscuit," do you reckon that would endear us to him?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
His biography on the lawyer's website here, it says, away from work, Simon is a keen sports fan and enjoys football, cricket, golf and rugby, also likes to go skiing. It makes no mention of the fact that he was a professional footballer, even less mention of the fact that he fell 50 feet down a lift shaft in Tenerife, which I don't know about you, but they would be the first things on my biography if those two things had happened to me.
Definitely,
So yeah, maybe we should drop Simon a line. Obviously, I'll say this, I always say it, but Simon, if you are listening, do get in touch. We'd love to hear more from you on that.
Do you think his legal firm specialises in accidents?
I didn't look that far into it. Hold on,
He was inspired.
Let's get it back and find out. Wait 1 second. Here we go. Legal services, just general. Oh, they've got their own podcast.
What?
Here we go. So it says here on the website, yeah, they've got their own podcast. So he'll have podcasting experience.
Oh, we could do.
I think this is getting better and better. Yeah, absolutely. So there you go, and there's plenty more where this came from. So I will drop them in over the weeks, and I'll give you some more obscure footballer potted biographies from the 96-97 Footballers Fact File.
My only other thing for the bulletin board is just a celebration of the 30th birthday or anniversary of... It's not really a birthday, it's an anniversary when it's an event. The anniversary of the Cantona Kung Fu kick at Selhurst Park back in 1995. Probably the most dramatic moment, one of the most dramatic moments of our footballing life, I would have thought, Stu. Definitely of the 90s.
More than that, I think it's the best football moment of the 90s.
It was also my nomination, I think, for the most 90s act of violence, I seem to remember. When
it
we
was.
did that many episodes ago. And I was just reading up on it and found some old articles about the case. And do you know the name of the person that he kicked, Stu?
Matthew Simmons, how could I forget that?
Very good, yeah. And he was 20 at the time. Do you know what he was alleged to have said by Cantona? I mean, without quoting it verbatim, maybe. Yes.
I don't know what Cantona says but I think I can remember what he said. He said,
Yes.
which I think. Stop me. Do you want me to go for it, or do you want to?
I'll say what Cantona said. He said first.
Okay, right.
It was basically he was shouting highly xenophobic abuse about Cantona going back to France and some other more aggressive and abusive xenophobic stuff, and then said something very misogynistic about Cantona's mother. But of course, that's not what Matthew Simmons claims he said, is it, Stu? What does he claim to have said?
If memory serves, I think he tried to claim that he said something like, off, 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 it's an early bath for you, Mr. Cantona, or something like that.
It's exactly what I've got here, yes. I don't know if he convinced the jury that he was a 18th century dandy shouting from the stands whilst spinning his rattle, but it didn't work, and he did get in trouble. Obviously, Cantona got in lots of trouble as well. He got a community service punishment, and Matthew Simmons got, I can't remember what his actual original punishment was, but when he was found guilty, he launched himself immediately over the the sort of barrier in the courtroom and attacked the prosecution lawyer, which resulted in him getting a week in prison. So it kind of mirroring Cantona's attack on him. But it doesn't seem like a particularly nice guy. Certainly at the time. I mean, he may have changed. If you're listening, Matthew, please do come on and get in touch and put your side of the story across. We'd love to hear from you. But it was
No, we wouldn't. I'd like to veto that. No, not having him on. Sorry.
Okay, sorry, you've blown it, Matthew. But yeah, I just wanted to bring that up because it is a significant anniversary in the world of 90s football. So yeah, I just wanted to give it a mention.
Frail side to his temperament, the mad side of genius. Cantona is dismissed. Where can there be a place in the game for a man of such extravagant talent, a man of such wicked temperament, a man who has been quite rightly dismissed, a man who has now jumped. Oh my goodness me! He has kicked, he's punched a fan! Eric Cantona has jumped in and scissor kung fu kick a fan! Manchester United fans are coming across. I have never seen as disgraceful an incident as that in all my years in football. Eric Cantona should be thrown out of the game for that sort of incident. I care not one jot about his supreme talent. He launched himself 6 feet into the crowd and kung fu kicked a supporter who was without a shadow of a doubt giving him lip, without a shadow of a doubt giving him stick.
News from the world of cars to finish on the bulletin board. This week, we have watched one of the greatest car adverts of all time, have we not?
We have indeed. You showed this to me earlier in the week, and I was suitably gleeful whilst watching it for the first time.
Well, it's only short, so I think we can probably play the audio in here, but this is an advert that Lada made in the early 90s, featuring none other than TV's very own Cannon & Ball.
I'm here to tell you about risky motoring.
Me too, Tommy, me too. This is risky, this is risky. Make 'em have it, Tommy, lad.
Some people risk buying a used car when they could quite easily afford a brand new Lada. You can drive away any new Lada for only £99 deposit. Typical APR, 19.5. Did you know that, Bobby?
No, I didn't. No.
Well, you do now.
Yes.
Or only £99 a month. And you know what else, Bobby?
What's that, Tommy?
You're covered.
I'm not, you know.
Yes, you are. Your payments are covered against accidents, sickness, redundancy, and you even get free life insurance. And no need to risk third-party insurance either. You get 1 year's fully comprehensive insurance for only £99. And they're guaranteed for 2 years or 50,000 miles. So there you have it. Nothing can go wrong. Can it, Bobby?
Don't expose yourself to unnecessary risks. Buy a brand new Lada and make sure you're covered.
You've ruined it, haven't you? I thought you said risky, Tommy. I thought you said risky.
And if you just listen to the amount of stuff that's on offer there, so the point that they're trying to put across is that you could buy a used car, or you could get a brand new Lada for the same price, or maybe even cheaper. You can get it for £99 a month. You can get free car insurance. They mention free life insurance as well, don't they?
Yeah, it doesn't inspire you a lot of confidence about the quality of the car or the safety of the car, does it? Actually, maybe it does. No, what am I saying? It's the exact opposite. They're so confident in the safety of it that they can give you life insurance. Yeah, sorry, Lard, I misunderstood sort of the point of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And your payments are protected against redundancy, sickness, that sort of thing. So they're really putting together quite the package here in order to try and convince you to invest in a Lada instead of a used car. Obviously, I'm looking back at this from a viewpoint of Ladas of the time having a little bit of retro chic, but I think I might have been swayed if I was a motorist at the time and looking for a new car. I mean, they were cheap anyway, and then to get all that thrown in on top, you know, bollocks to anyone laughing at me for driving a Lada because I've got a great deal.
Yeah, and you've got you've got life insurance. You can just
exactly.
You can wave that out the window when you're driving down Pickwick in Caution with your brand new Lada. Yeah, I've always had a soft spot for the Lada Riva. It's much maligned, much laughed at, but you know, I think if that's the deal you're getting, then the joke's on everyone else, isn't it? So,
I'm a Samara man myself.
Ah, okay, yes.
Just to link back briefly to our secondary school episode from last time, I'm sure there was a teacher at Caution who drove a Lada, big one, but I can't remember who it was. I'm sure I used to see it in the car park all the time.
I had a primary school teacher who drove Skoda, the Skoda that looked very similar to a Lada, and this was obviously of the era when Skoda were the big, like, laughing stock of the motoring world. But I'm not sure about Ladas.
Okay, well, we'll put that one out to the listeners. Anybody who was at Corsham School at the time. Let us know. Maybe Big Tim will know. He's coming around on Saturday to fix our water butt downpipe again. So I'll ask him, see if he knows.
God, please let another mishap occur when that happens, because that was the highlight of last time.
We're getting the tarpaulin out this time and both wearing anoraks.
Time now for What's the Most 90s. And Stu, this is something that's a little bit out of my wheelhouse, so I have enlisted some help with this one who can speak far more eloquently and knowledgeably on this subject than I can. I'm asking you what the most 90s wrestler is. Who the most 90s wrestler is, I should say.
Well, this is a subject that I can speak on with a modicum of authority because there was a very brief time in the late 90s when I was obsessed with wrestling. And this coincided with the time when it was being shown free-to-air on Channel 4. And I remember very clearly the Royal Rumble being heavily trailed because it was going to be live on Channel 4, but it was like at 1 a.m. or something, starting at 1 a.m. On like a Saturday or Sunday morning. So obviously not staying up to watch that. Probably tapped the old Video Plus numbers in and got it videoed to watch the next day. And I got for my, I suppose it must have been my 11th birthday, a little wrestling playset from the Argos catalogue, of course. Now, I went back to the Argos catalogue archive to see if I could find the exact one that I got. Unfortunately, it wasn't there, but I remember there was a little ring with elasticated ropes, and there was 5 or 6 different figures and a belt and everything like that. And the wrestler that I remember most clearly from that playset was a guy called Ahmed Johnson, who actually, on looking at it, had actually retired from wrestling by the time that I got hold of this playset, but clearly was still included in the action figures. So I don't really know much about Ahmed Johnson and his wrestling career, other than the fact that once he retired, he earned a degree in criminology. So like our friend Simon Dakin, he's left the sporting arena behind and gone on to a higher calling. So we've had a footballer turned lawyer and a wrestler turned criminologist already. But Ahmed Johnson is one of the figures that I remember playing with this set, and for that reason I've chosen him as my most 90s wrestler, because that is the biggest memory I have of wrestling in the 90s, is playing with that set and him being part of that set.
Very nice. That is not someone I've ever heard of, but that doesn't say very much because wrestling is, as I said, very much out of my wheelhouse. And that's why I've really struggled with this. And my only experiences of wrestling really are sort of midway through primary school, so 92, 3 sort of time. There was a craze for WWF in our school, and yeah, I'm not quite sure where that came from and why it was so popular, because it didn't seem like something that crossed my radar very much, but maybe it was just more in the zeitgeist at that time. But the people who do stand out, and I only because I heard people talking about it, and maybe I saw them on TV a bit, is Hulk Hogan and The Undertaker. Maybe Hulk Hogan was pre-90s and then spanned into the 90s as well. I know The Undertaker went on way into the 2010s, maybe even is still wrestling, I'm not sure. But he was talked about, and that seems, from what I could absorb through osmosis, it was like the rivalry. So they would be my answer, but I'm so unqualified, I don't really feel like I can put forward anything seriously, which is why I have enlisted the help of Dom Smith from the Soundsphere online magazine, but also the WrestleSphere online magazine, absolute expert in his field, and this is what Dom has to say.
Hi guys, it's Dom from the Gimme a Hull Yeah Wrestling podcast, right here on the 90s podcast. Thank you guys so much for having me. The most 90s thing, I think, is the DX chop. I mean, you can't get much more of a time and of a culture than the DX chop, and suck it, and everybody was doing it. People are still doing it now. I think if you want to talk about the legacy of something so 90s, that was the DX chop. It was in schools, it was in colleges, it was in universities, it was across the world. I even saw some teachers doing it back in the day. Do you know what I mean? People that were teaching, people that were academics were doing it because it was so ingrained within popular culture. So I think, despite my favourite wrestler being Mankind, the answer to your question about the most 90s wrestler probably Triple H, Shawn Michaels, even though these guys were obviously originated, Shawn Michaels was a little bit earlier, but I would say Triple H, who is now, of course, the CEO, head of creative in WWE, the head honcho, is probably the most 90s wrestler because he was doing the DX chop. Of course, you can extend that to the NWO in WCW, but for me personally, the guy that kind of embodies that 90s spirit really was Triple H in the 90s, doing the suck it chop, being anti-establishment, and obviously the culture that surrounded that and how much that kind of got invested in in sort of schools, colleges, academic institutions, and the like. It was everywhere. It was the DX chop and the suck it, But yeah, guys. So we have a wrestling podcast. Give me a hull, yeah. Come and check us out. Of course, you can find me on Soundsphere magazine and WrestleSphere as well. We just launched Screensphere for film and TV. Thank you so much for having me on the podcast and hosting this clip. Hopefully that answers your question. Triple H is the most 90s wrestler in my opinion. Of course, that is a divisive opinion, given that he's so prominent now. There are of course many other people that embody the 90s, but that kind of DX, D-Generation X, and those wrestlers and the suck it chop does it for me, I would say. So the most 90s thing, the suck it chop, DX, most 90s wrestler, Triple H. See you guys soon. Thanks for watching.
Well, Stu, Triple H and the DX chop. What are your reactions to that?
Not too familiar with the name of the move or the suck it thing or anything like that, but Triple H obviously is one that I recall because he was another one of the figures in that playset. So obviously still having a big effect on wrestling today as he did in the 90s. So yeah, I think that's a really strong shout from Dom there, our man in the know. Can I just make a request that Hulk Hogan is stricken from the record for this What's the Most 90s because of his recent activities in the political stratum, which I'm sure we don't wish to talk about in great detail, but I feel that he doesn't really warrant our inclusion or attention on here.
Yes, I definitely do not want him in the ledger, so I'm fully behind that.
So it's between Ahmed Johnson, The Undertaker, and Triple H then?
I am very happy to defer to both of you on this, so I don't know. What do you think?
Well, I think they were both in this playset that I had, so clearly they were both major players in late 90s wrestling. But I think because of the fact that Triple H is a recognisable name to me still, a wrestling layman, and the fact that he is now high up in the wrestling organisation itself, I think we're going to have to go with him.
Yeah, that sounds fair. Well done, Dom. You've got your choice into the ledger. You can find Dom's work on Soundsphere and WrestleSphere linked to in the episode description below. Fantastic websites, both. So you should definitely go and check them out. And also you can find Dom's social media linked to also in the episode description below. So please do go and check out Dom's content because it is fantastic. And yeah, we really appreciate his input in today's What's the Most 90s.
As Alex takes another swig from his bottle of reef, it's time for us to move on to our main topic for tonight's show. Loaded, Lads, Mags and Mayhem, the recent BBC Two documentary, which bills itself as a nostalgic romp through the rise and fall of the 90s Lads Mag phenomenon. Now Alex, we've both watched this recently, and the first thing I have to say is that I am always very wary of documentaries that mark themselves as containing upsetting scenes. So I was wondering what you would ask me to do here, but fortunately it wasn't as bad as some things that I've had to watch for this podcast.
No, it's no Davro in the stocks, is it? So yes, this documentary was first aired in November last year, and as is traditional, we have missed that by a good couple of months. But I found it, really interesting actually, and that's why I suggested the episode, because it's a really interesting sort of lens to look at the decade through. And obviously we come at the 90s from all sorts of different angles on this podcast, whether it's light-hearted stuff, whether it's TV, music, politics, anything really, and this just seemed like a new, fresh one for us to do. And I thought it was a really interesting documentary, and not too upsetting, but definitely made me think about certain things and remember things, some fondly, some less fondly. Mm-hmm. What did you think about it?
Yeah, I mean, normally when there's a documentary about the 90s which contains upsetting scenes, that means it's got clips from The Word in it. And it was the case with Boy Bands Forever. I actually watched the first episode of that twice, and then on the second time I knew where to fast forward the clips from the Word, because I'd been perturbed by them the first time. There were some clips from the Word in this documentary, but they weren't as bad, actually, I should say, so that's absolutely fine. My biggest connection to James Brown in recent years, who is the founder and editor of Loaded, who obviously features in this documentary quite a lot, is the book Above Head Height, which I read of his quite a few years ago now, but it's his sort of love letter to five-a-side football. Okay. And it doesn't really talk about the magazine a lot, but it just obviously talks about his days playing five-a-side, which I think he took up when he sort of gave up the lifestyle that he was living in order to make Loaded magazine, or the lifestyle that was presented to him when he was doing that. And also just a word for his hair, which was an absolutely fine barnet during the salad days of Loaded.
Yeah, it was an interesting look, quite a surprising look for the very sort of zenith of lad culture. Quite brave, and I quite admired that. Yeah, he was an interesting character, and he, as you say, Stu, he was sort of the main focal point of this documentary, wasn't he? He was the talking head and the interviewee, as Loaded was the main magazine that gets talked about. But they do address other magazines naturally, because they are talking about lads mags in general. I was quite surprised to read that some of these other ones started a lot, not just before Loaded, but way before. So there was GQ that started in the 50s as Gentleman's Quarterly, and then there was Esquire, which started even earlier in the 30s, and FHM started in 1992. Well, it actually started in 85 as For Him magazine, and then became FHM in 92. So they were all already on the scene when Loaded came in. And I thought it was sort of interesting how they said there were these magazines for men, I suppose. They weren't really lads mags at that point. Maybe FHM was, I'm not sure. But they weren't aimed at working class, or I don't want to say normal, because that's kind of a vacuous, trite word, but just the everyman on the street, I suppose. And then Loaded filled that gap.
I think so. They make a point in the documentary, don't they, early on, of saying that these magazines, like GQ in particular, were glossy, and it was about high culture and things that may not be accessible, as you say, to the man on the street. And then Loaded came along and started writing about those things, which was why it became really popular really quickly. There's an interesting point that one of the talking heads makes, which is that pre the internet being widely available, magazines were pretty much everything for magazines and newspapers for information conveyance and things like that, things that you would use the internet for now normally. And when I thought back to that, that's entirely correct, because I used to get Match and Shoot every week, or every however often they were published. It might have been a fortnight, I can't recall, but I used to get those regularly. Sometimes I'll be lucky enough to get my hands on a copy of something like 442 as well. And I'm sorry, this is all heavily football based, I know, but you had to get magazines that were about the things you were interested in if you wanted to find things out. Whereas nowadays, you can just do that on the internet.
It is almost impossible to remember what that was like when the information that we got came from channels 1 to 5, well, originally just 1 to 4, or the radio, and again at that point 1 to 4, then 5 was added. And apart from that, you had to go to magazines. It's really hard to remember what that was like. And if your interest was a bit more niche, like we're talking about football here, which did get quite a lot of coverage in mainstream media, but if it was niche, like I don't know, rock music or tennis or cars, I suppose, as you say, it was all magazines. It's just impossible to remember, like, even though we lived through that. So you can see how Loaded managed to get so big and so popular, because it wasn't just a gap in the magazine market, it's a gap in like just the information market in a way.
I'll just tie off the football content here by referring to James Brown saying that he conceived the idea for Loaded at a football match between Leeds United and Stuttgart in the European Cup in 1992. And this is a little bit of an oddity in European Cup history. This was a two-legged tie. The second leg originally finished as a 4-1 win for Leeds United, thus 4-4 on aggregate, with VfB Stuttgart winning on away goals. But the match was later awarded as a 3-0 victory for Leeds due to Stuttgart's illegal use of foreign players, resulting in a 3-3 aggregate score without the away goals rule and a playoff being ordered to determine the winner. So Leeds United actually got a little bit of a reprieve there, and they won the playoff, which was played at the new camp, and then that set up then the famous Battle of Britain match between Leeds and Rangers in the second round. So just a little bit of football trivia for you there. Loaded was conceived at one of the European Cup's oddest matches in recent history.
That is exactly why you get paid the big bucks, Stu. For that sort of investigative research and spotting where there's a story. That's not something I'd ever heard of before, so yeah, great work bringing that to our attention.
As long as they keep dropping the crates of reef off at my door every fortnight, I'll keep doing the investigative journalism. I noticed there were a lot of cycling tops in this documentary in various photographs and archive footage. Is that something you enjoyed? I know you're a fan of a cycling top.
Yes, I do like a good cycling top, especially a slightly retro one. Not quite of that era. But yeah, that's not something I remember being a fashion in the 90s. But I suppose in the early 90s I was less aware of that stuff. But it was nice to see, yeah.
Mm-hmm. And there's a couple of little bits as well in the archive footage. Did you see Gazza's BMW 328 parked outside his house when he's being hounded by the press outside?
Yes, yeah, that was nice, yeah.
And another thing about Gazza's house was that he had the basketball hoop up over the garage door, which I don't think is something you see very much nowadays. Yeah. Let's bring back the basketball hoop over the garage door.
Yeah, definitely. They're everywhere in America, aren't they? And they must have come over here as an American import, but it's not really lasted very long. I think our driveways just aren't quite big enough in this country, are they? Like, you take a couple of shots, it hits a rim, and then it's like over your neighbour's fence, isn't it? So
I keep asking Beth if I can put one up on the side of the shed, but she's not having it. It was, of course, only a matter of time as well before they used Girls and Boys by Blur as part of the soundtrack. I was waiting for it to come up.
Yes, yeah. I think the soundtrack to this documentary is amazing. There's so many nostalgic songs, and I'm going to talk about a specific one towards the end, but yeah, great soundtrack. And of course, Girls and Boys was there.
Mm-hmm. Very interestingly, another musical point I'd like to make is that when they hand a copy of the first issue of Loaded to the various talking heads in the documentary, did you see the advert on the back page?
No, I don't think I did.
Okay. It's an advert for the Division Bell album by Pink Floyd, which must have been coming out around that time.
Oh, right, okay.
And I thought it was considering the content of the magazine, I wouldn't have thought that lads would have been that interested in Pink Floyd at that point in 1994, when they were sort of making their swan song as an active band with that album, great album though it is, and charting singles though it had. It just felt a tiny bit incongruous, but lovely to see it there on the back page. A lovely piece of Pink Floyd cover art, as it always was, and nice to see it there. But yeah, it was a slightly strange feeling to see it.
I suppose that says something about how the publishers didn't quite know how well it was going to go down and who was going to read it. So they hadn't quite worked out who the readership was going to be, and therefore who the advert should be aimed at. I reckon that's maybe connected to that.
Oh yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, fair enough.
So, talking of covers, actually, one thing that really stood out to me quite early in this documentary, they show a lot of Loaded covers, because obviously talking mainly about Loaded, and it was quite striking how many covers had men on them compared to women. There were very few that had women on the front, and that was kind of surprising because of what I remember about Lads Mags. They were very objectifying with their front covers, and it was all scantily clad women. But yeah, back in especially those first few years of Loaded, it was mainly men, wasn't it? And the front cover of the first issue is Gary Oldman, like maybe the most iconic Loaded cover. And yeah, it is mainly men. That was surprising to me.
Yeah, I noticed a cover with Leslie Nielsen on it as well at one point, which was really good to see. And then obviously the change happens over time, which we will get to a bit later, I'm sure. But certainly at the start, there were just really famous men on the cover, weren't they? And that was it. David Baddiel's massive earring, I've got down here as a note.
Yeah.
He should get that back, I think. As the wearer of a more discreet earring myself, I've often wondered what I would look like if I just put in a massive gold hoop there. And then maybe go Brian Harvey style and get them in both ears, I think.
Yeah. Do it for the upcoming disco.
Yes, there's an idea. Although I would have to get my right ear pierced. That's the thing. I don't have the hole there. So
okay.
Yeah. There's quite a long section on the Loaded tour, which they end up going on, and it looks like they might have produced a free VHS or something to go with the magazine of highlights from the tour. And my note here is, it simply says, "Loaded tour, my idea of hell."
That was sort of later, wasn't it? A little bit over the hump of the magazine, when they were kind of slightly on the downward trajectory. But it does contrast with the beginning, where they seem, it's just so it's kind of haphazard, pleasingly haphazard, and it just seems like a group of mates just with this idea, and they're just throwing it together, and there's lots of energy and youthful vigor, and it looks really fun. But yeah, as you say, the tour, it's a bit darker. Everyone who works on the magazine just seems knackered and relying on drink and drugs to just get through it, and the audiences seem quite toxic and just a bit unpleasant. And I did think this would be Stu's idea of hell. I wouldn't like it either, but I can imagine Stu really looking at this with anxiety. So
maybe this is the upsetting scene that they were talking about.
Yeah, maybe. Well, yeah, it upset you, so it could be.
Yeah, this is definitely the sort of lad culture at its worst, I would say. It is displayed in this excerpt about the Loaded tour, with the things that the talking heads say were shouted at the models when they're brought on stage, things like that, and the sort of physical threat that seemed to be pervading into the room as well. Yeah, at that point, as you say, it seems like the original intention of the magazine had been lost, and they were going quite far down a path that they would be unable to come back from.
Yeah, definitely. Earlier in the documentary, they refer to a feature they were trying to write on the Cannes Film Festival, and one of the main writers has this idea, like, I'll go to the festival, meet all these stars, see all these films, and write a big feature on it. And then he goes, and he basically can't get in anywhere.
He doesn't have a press pass, does he?
No, he hasn't got a press pass, so he can't go and see many films. He doesn't speak to any stars. He manages to go to at least one party, and there's free drink, so he just gets absolutely wasted and sort of doesn't meet anyone of note. And he's flying back, and he's panicking that he hasn't got anything. That's been a waste of time. But then they turn that into the feature, really, that he went and he couldn't get in anywhere, and they managed to write around it. And yeah, and that sort of thing I think looks quite appealing to me, that it does look like it's being slightly haphazardly put together, and it doesn't look like there's loads of pressure. People are giving each other a break, and they're working through it, and yeah, it just looks fun. And yeah, that descended, but yeah, it's just a real contrast between that and, as you say, the party and some of the other stuff that happened later. But you mentioned David Baddiel. I think he has some of the most interesting contributions to this documentary, and he talks about the changing definition of the word lad, which hadn't really occurred to me before this, but I think up until this point, lad had a different meaning, had its original meaning, didn't it? And I think he refers to being referred to as a lad in another magazine, and it's like an innocent version of it. And then, mid-90s come along and it changes. And I think is that a forever change, do you think? Do you think we'll ever get back to the original version of lad?
I don't think it will, no. I think it's forever really going to be associated with that culture that began in the 90s. I think there are still certain groups of people, if you saw them in the street or in a pub or whatever, you would call them lads, or lads, all that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Still pervades today. So no, yeah, I think it's there forever. I think it's there for good.
I think it is too useful a word now, because as you say, when you see that group of guys in a certain setting, and you're recounting it to someone, maybe the police, it is the best way. It's everyone knows what you mean when you say that. If you say a group of men, it's much more ambiguous. It could mean anything. It could maybe sound more threatening or more innocuous. But with lad, you kind of know where you stand with that. So it's maybe just too useful to go back on. So yeah, it's not necessarily a bad thing. But another thing that David Baddiel says is that I found really interesting was that this was an era where everyone thought we had gender equality and like sexism was solved, and therefore it was okay to sort of joke about stuff in a sexist way, because you could just say it was ironic. It would be ironic sexism. Yeah, this is kind of the era of a backlash against feminism, I suppose, the post-feminism in inverted commas era. And I thought that was really interesting, and how society sort of thought, well, the best way to celebrate the fact that we've got over sexism is to get really objectifying about women and like go full on into that, and yeah, just treat them much more like sex objects than maybe we did even before this. So it was just a weird, ironic and unpleasant sort of twist that came out of that, which sort of leads on to the topic of Ladettes in a way, because that's another really interesting element of lad culture, isn't it? Is, especially in the 90s, is Ladette culture, which I think actually probably stayed in the 90s. It didn't last in the same way that lad culture, you still have lad culture now, whereas Ladette culture, I think, was very much of a time.
Yeah.
With, you know, Zoe Ball and Sarah Cox get mentioned a lot in this episode. Denise Van Outen's in it as well. I was disappointed to see that Jane Middlemiss didn't get any mention at all. She is my favourite Ladette, as I think I've said on the pod before. But it's a really interesting era. I could almost do a whole episode just on Ladette culture. I saw this quote from I was looking up some articles on Ladette culture, and I saw this quote from Professor Angela Smith of Sunderland University, who says, it took the old stuffy gender model where the man went out boozing and the woman patiently waited up and flipped it. Yeah, it seemed positive on the surface. It was getting rid of those old gender norms and that sort of stuffy dynamic of the woman staying at home, and said, look, you can go out and do whatever you want, and you can get drunk with the guys and get into football and stuff. But I think actually there was probably still loads of judgment put on those women, and those women, those Ladettes, like Sarah Cox and Zoe Ball, were judged so harshly in the tabloid media, and they had, you know, paparazzi outside the clubs waiting to get a photo of them falling over, and then they could sort of be judged as letting themselves down and letting women and girls down. So on the face of it, it seemed like it was very liberating for them, but actually I think, I mean, it wasn't really, was it? It was just a different form of judgment. And the episode then goes on to talk about Gail Porter, isn't it? And that's like a real low point, I think, for women in this story.
Absolutely, I have nothing but the deepest respect and love for Gail Porter after revisiting this story and hearing her side of it. But this is the one that wasn't to do with Loaded at all, was it? It was FHM who actually projected that photo of her onto the side of the building. So this is FHM and not Loaded. But the point is made that Loaded had done a similar thing years previously, and it hadn't got nearly the traction that this stunt did. But this was at the time when Loaded was having to increasingly forget what it had started out to do in order to keep up with its competitors, the publishing house and the people who were putting the money in. The advertisers wanted more pictures of females in the magazine, and that was what they were increasingly have to do in order to try and keep up, and this is what created this situation. And yeah, I think that it's absolutely sort of shocking that the way that Gail Porter was treated after that, and the fact that she wasn't really informed of how it was going to be used and what was going to be done with the photo. And yeah, it's just a horrible situation all round, really.
Yeah, it was so cynical, wasn't it? And not really any thought put into how it would affect her. It was just about the magazine and ratings and publicity, and the men who made those decisions, and the newspapers who dealt with it in the ways they did, and the men, presumably men who then blacklisted Gail after that, and, you know, didn't have her as the presenter for Live and Kicking and various other things. I would recommend a really good interview with Gail Porter that was in The Guardian, I think towards the end of last year. I'll put a link below in the episode description because it's well worth reading. It's nice to hear her side of that story and also other stories from the era. So yeah, do read that.
Definitely. I know I said I was done with football, but just on the Gail Porter section of the episode, bring back Soccer 6. That's all I want to say. Bring back Soccer 6.
I don't remember that. What was that?
It was a yearly celebrity football tournament that took place at a football stadium somewhere, and 6-a-side teams made up of celebrities would play against each other in a tournament. And I'm not entirely sure why it doesn't happen anymore. That's one of the good things that came out of this era, was the Soccer 6. Yeah, let's have that back, please.
Okay, yeah. Agreed. I did also, the final thing on the Gail Porter section was how depressing the clip of her on Nevermind the Buzzcocks was.
Oh, Christ, yeah.
The sort of thing that I think if I'd watched that at the time, which I may well have done, maybe just wouldn't have really noticed or would have just been used to it, but it's just grim, isn't it? Very sort of upsetting and depressing.
I'm sure the people who were involved don't look back on that with very much pride.
There's a really good quote, I think, from James Brown towards the end, where he says, the 90s weren't just the last decade of the millennium, they were like last orders. I thought that was a really astute way of looking at the 90s. It was like the end of an era. It was kind of weird, wasn't it, the 90s, because it started, well, actually it wasn't even the start of it, it was midway through with the rise of New Labour, where it felt like a new dawn after over a decade or decades of sort of Black Wednesday and all the strikes over the 70s and 80s and the miners' strikes, and everything was coming out of it, and it felt like this sort of new start. But also, by the end of it, it felt like it was the end of a chapter. And then, of course, we had 9/11, and that is often seen as the end of an era and the beginning of a new global age and a much darker period. So it's just a weird mix of a brand new start and then everything coming to an end, all just within like 5 years, 5-6 years. It's fascinating for that. It's one of the reasons I suppose I find the 90s so fascinating, that dichotomy.
Lots of things were changing in a short space of time, and I can't really put it any better than you have, really, mate. And this whole Loaded magazine thing was a part of that. Obviously, the documentary then, I mean, I think we're reaching the end now if we're talking about it chronologically, but it goes on to talk about the 2000s, when it lost even more ground to alternative publications like Nuts and Zoo magazine. The less said about those, the better, of course. And then on to its eventual collapse in about 2012, when print media then was basically on its last legs all round, just because of the ease of use of the internet and people turning away from print media as their primary form of entertainment and information gathering.
It just feels like a distant memory now, doesn't it? That era of the great magazine power. I mean, the final montage of this program is so good. I think I'm a sucker for a montage, full stop, really, musical montage. But there's something I've always found really alluring and romantic about seeing people reminisce about how much they partied in the 90s and how crazy it was. And even if we know that it was fueled by like excessive drugs and too much drink, and there were lots of dark moments in it, I still find it sort of conjures a powerful nostalgic emotion for me, even though I wasn't there. I mean, I was alive in the 90s, but I wasn't old enough to be partying like that. I think, yeah, just seeing that, it really like strikes a chord with me. If you're going to put Bronski Beats' Small Town Boy as the soundtrack to that montage, then I'm gone, like I'm dead and gone, because it's, yeah. And they've accompanied the montage with photos from the time, and yeah, like showing how much fun it was with that soundtrack, and it's really good. Yeah, I thought it was a great end to a good documentary. What did you come away with in terms of your feelings towards Loaded? Let's talk specifically about Loaded first. Like, what did you come away with from this documentary?
I liked the sound of the early incarnation of it, but obviously when it then goes on and starts doing these things to try and keep up with its competitors, any warmth I felt for the idea and the publication dissipated, really.
Yeah, I'm kind of similar. I definitely have mixed feelings about the whole Loaded history. I think it's quite admirable in some ways, the way that it started out as this new idea that was trying to give a sort of content to people who were neglected by things like GQ, that was very aimed at sort of aspirational yuppies, and it wasn't very genuine. And I like that sort of slightly working class ethos. And I mean, I can't deny that it looked really appealing to me, that those early days basically just working with your mates in that casual way. But then on the other hand, like you say, it became a bit more repellent, and there were things. I think it's the co-founder and deputy editor says how proud he is of the fact that they sort of push back against the new man, in inverted commas, and political correctness. And I don't like that. I don't think that's something you should be proud of. If it sounds very similar to what people say today about woke, and I find all of that very distasteful. So I'm in two minds. And then, like you say, when you look at stuff like Nuts and Zoo magazine and where they all ended up, Loaded, especially those first few years, seems really quite tame and quite likeable. So yeah, I definitely got a real mixed message, which is a sign of a good documentary, I suppose, for something like this. Like, it gives the whole... I find something kind of intrinsically romantic about the story arc that shows, like, the early optimistic, youthful days. Then you've got the sort of the glory days, the hedonism and the excess, and then you have the sort of come down. And that is what the Loaded story is, isn't it? And I like anything that has that story, and this documentary and the magazine Loaded has all of that. So yeah, I definitely like it. So should we just have a quick think about what our experiences were of lads mags and lad culture? I mean, I'm gonna have to allow you to go a little bit into the 2000s because you are a bit younger than me, and I was too young. But did you have any experience of lads mags when you were growing up? Any interaction with them?
In a sideways way, yes, because I was reading magazines like Max Power in those early 2000s when I was interested in the sort of cars and modifications to cars and things like that, which was another brief interest that I had. And even those magazines by then had started doing that kind of thing in order to sell more copies. So really, like I say, not a proper lads mag. It was a car magazine, but still with those elements of lads mags there. And round that time, I was still sort of mainly really into pop music rather than rock music. So I wasn't into things like Oasis and bands like that around that time. My introduction to rock music, the first band I really liked was Stereophonics, and they weren't in the press doing laddie things and fighting and stuff like that. It was only when I got hold of it was a behind-the-scenes VHS of the making of their videos for the second album, which I think I've mentioned on here before. I've mentioned most things on here before. But it was only then that you realise that, okay, so yeah, they do swear a bit and they go out drinking and stuff, but they were never really in the press for the wrong reasons. So when it was all actually happening in the eye of the storm, I didn't really have a lot of connection with it. I had a sort of very naive view of things, I suppose.
Yeah, I'm similar-ish in that I was too young for the eye of the storm, as you put it. But I did have a little bit of sort of exposure to lads mags. I had a friend who would sometimes buy FHM, and it was always really thrilling. But to be honest, it was like, this was obviously before the internet. The only way of seeing scantily clad women was late night on Channel 5 if you were lucky with a cheeky nude scene, or lads mags. And as a heterosexual teenage boy, it was something I was sort of, to be honest, was kind of keen to try and find, and that was it. And it was kind of it felt illicit. Like, I would never buy one myself. It just felt like that isn't something you do. It's not something I'd be confident enough to do, and I just would have felt, I guess, kind of a bit of shame really if I was trying to buy that myself. So it was just through other people having them, and I think this was pre Nuts and Zoo, which came out well into the 2000s. So they were still fairly tame by then. It was like top 100 sexiest women, and there was still like sports content in there and stuff. So it was, it wasn't too bad then, but they were still they felt illicit. But I was too young really to really get into lads mags. And in terms of 90s lad culture in general, is it something that you think affected your life at all when you were growing up, whether at the end of the 90s or the early 2000s?
I don't think so, no. I think I was slightly too young, and also I wasn't really that cool. I've always been a bit of a square, so I wasn't really looking to get involved in anything like that or looking up to anybody who behaved like that. And thinking back to where my parents live and where I grew up, is there was two of the town's most well-known drinking establishments were within easy reach. So there must have been, I must have seen people out and about heading between these places and seeing them who were right in the maelstrom of it. But no, I have to say, I'm afraid it's a bad answer. But no, I don't really think it did.
I think that's fair enough with the year we were born and when we came of age. But I think for me, I did feel some impact of it, but not quite as directly as being in pubs and clubs and whatnot. It was more the way that boys at my school, me included, would feel pressure to behave. So, at the tail end of primary school and all through secondary school, you pretty much had to be into football. You couldn't be sort of flamboyant in any way. You couldn't show too much emotion. You couldn't be affectionate. And any sort of stepping out of line in those ways would inevitably result in you being called gay, which is something we talked about a lot in the last episode. And I think that is probably, if not a result of, but certainly enhanced by 90s lad culture. Like, it didn't help any of those things. So I think, they were the negative impacts I think I felt as a teenager. I'm sure there were some positives that came from it as well that are maybe harder to link, but looking back, I don't think there was a lot of positives that came out of it for people my age and around, the teen years. So a bit of a downer, but I think that's just the subject we're dealing with, isn't it?
So to finish then, if we were going to make a 90s lad cocktail, if you like, what do we think the elements would be? Having now watched this documentary and got as much of a first-hand view as we're ever going to, what do you think the main elements are of a 90s lad?
I think lager. Lager was the drink, wasn't it? Mm-hmm. Maybe a bit of alcohol pop here and there, but this was like, there was nothing more exciting than Carling, Carlsberg, Foster's, that sort of thing. That is the lad culture drink, I think. Smoking, something that is pretty much gone now. Of course, it's been replaced by vaping, but smoking a good old-fashioned Marlboro, I think, was very lad culture. Lots of photos. Like, isn't it? Gary Oldman's got a cigarette in his mouth, hasn't he, on the front cover of that first Loaded?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah. Football, obviously. Three Lions is probably the absolute zenith of lad culture, football, music, all combined into one. And I mean, I love that song and I love everything about that. I don't think that's a shameful thing at all, but that is where it sort of went, And then, I guess that you mentioned music. I think it's got to be Britpop, hasn't it?
It has to be, doesn't it? Yeah, there can't be any other genre. It has to be Britpop.
Yeah, maybe a bit of dance music thrown in for the sort of ravers. And then I think also gaming as well, to some extent. When the PlayStation came along, that crossed over into that world of lads, whereas before it had been a bit more nerdy, for want of a better word, and more niche. But I think PlayStation brought it to the masses, and they really marketed that at young men a lot, I think. So maybe that as well. They'd be and also maybe a bit of motoring. Max Power, like you said, there was a crossover there, I think. So they would be my ingredients for making a 90s lad.
Well, we hope you enjoyed that look at last November's BBC Two documentary on Loaded magazine. If you have anything to contribute, if you've seen the documentary, if you want to add your own thoughts on it, if you have any thoughts on the career of former Hull City midfielder Simon Dakin, if there's anything that you'd like to get in touch that we've spoken about on this episode or any other episode, Alex, how can the listeners get in touch?
All you have to do is scroll down to the episode description where you will find our link tree, and there will be links there to our Instagram, our email address, our YouTube, and probably not for that much longer our Twitter accounts. Something I need to talk to you about there, Stu. But they are the ways to get in touch with us. Don't use Twitter, just use the other ones. And we'd love to hear from you.
Absolutely. Please do keep your messages rolling in, because it's the lifeblood of this podcast. It's not our show, It's your show.
That's a lovely sentiment.
In true pod fashion, we're not quite sure yet what we are up to next time, because we're getting ready for our appearance with Catherine and Dan on the Now That's What I Call Bullshit pod, so do look out for that. It might be out by the time you hear this, not entirely sure, but we should be on there soon, so do keep an eye out for that. Until next time we meet, it's goodbye from me. I'm just off to get my right ear pierced and put a really big earring in it.
And it's goodbye from me. I am just off to purchase a larder with some free life insurance.
Oh, nice deal, nice deal.
Goodbye.
Bye for now.